Clara Whitfield pressed her back against the cold wall of the bridal room and let the tears fall. Not because she was afraid of the man waiting at the altar, but because she finally understood what no one had bothered to tell her. This marriage wasn't a rescue, it was a transaction, and she was the price being paid. If you're watching this for the first time, subscribe and hit that bell and drop your city in the comments below, so I can see just how far this story has traveled. The morning Clara Whitfield was supposed to become the happiest woman in Sutter's Crossing. She stood at the window of the church dressing room in her dead mother's wedding dress and realized she was about to make the worst mistake of her life. Not because she didn't know what she was doing, because she knew exactly what she was doing, and she was going to do it anyway. Outside, she could hear the town gathering, the creak of wagon wheels, the shuffle of boot heels on dry summer earth. Women in cotton dresses fanning themselves in the morning heat, talking in low voices, the way women talked when they were pretending not to gossip. She heard her name more than once. Clara Whitfield. Poor thing. Clara Whitfield. What was she thinking? Clara Whitfield. I heard she had no choice. That last one was the only true thing any of them said. She pressed her fingers against the window glass and looked out at the mountains. The peaks were sharp against a blue summer sky, so pale it looked almost white. Up there, somewhere above the tree line, was the cabin where she would be living by nightfall. She had never seen it. She had never been invited to see it. She had only been told it existed the way you might tell someone about a place you've heard of, but never visited yourself. She had met the man she was marrying exactly twice. The first time was across a lawyer's desk with papers between them, and a man named Gerald Hatch reading aloud from documents she hadn't fully understood. The second time was 4 days ago on the front steps of the general store, when he had passed her on his way out and paused just long enough to look at her. Really look at her before pulling his hat down and walking away without a word. He hadn't smiled. He hadn't spoken. He had simply looked at her the way a man looks at something he isn't sure about, and then he had gone. That was Cade Merritt. The man everyone in Sutter's Crossing called the ghost of Ridgeline Mountain. Not to his face. Nobody said anything to his face. They said it the way people say things they believe but won't own behind hands in back rooms across fences in the early morning. They said he had broken a woman's heart so badly she left the territory and never came back. They said he hadn't spoken more than 50 words to anyone in town in the past 3 years. They said he came down off that mountain maybe 4 times a year, bought what he needed, and went back up before anyone could corner him long enough to ask him anything. They said he was cold. They said he was harsh. They said living with him would be like living with a stone wall that occasionally remembered it was supposed to feed the horses. Clara had listened to all of it. And then she had signed the papers anyway, because the alternative was losing the only thing her father had left her. Her father, George Whitfield, had died in April. Not dramatically. Not in the kind of way that leaves a story behind. He had simply gone to sleep one Tuesday evening and not woken up the following morning, and by the time Clara had realized something was wrong, he was already past the point where anything could be done. She had buried him beside her mother on the western edge of their property, under the 2 cottonwood trees he'd planted the year Clara was born, and then the letters had started arriving. The first one came from a man named Aldous Crane. She hadn't known that name then. She knew it very well now. The letter was polite in the way that letters are polite when politeness is being used as a weapon. Careful language, measured phrasing. The kind of words that sound reasonable until you read them 3 times and understand what's actually being said. What was being said was this: the Whitfield property, all 112 acres of grazing land and river access on the south slope of Ridgeline, didn't fully belong to Clara. It belonged in part to Aldous Crane, because her father had borrowed money from Aldous Crane 8 years ago, and the terms of that loan, buried in language that Clara suspected her father had never fully read, gave Crane the right to claim partial ownership of the land if the loan was not repaid in full within 3 years of the borrower's death. Her father had been dead for 6 weeks. The loan had never been repaid. Clara had taken the letter to 3 different men in town. The first was the sheriff, who read it slowly, handed it back, and told her she needed a lawyer. The second was the lawyer, who read it even more slowly, charged her $2 for the consultation, and told her the document appeared to be legally sound. The third was Reverend Calloway, who read it, set it down on his desk, and told her he would pray for her. None of them had helped her. None of them had offered to. And while she was going from door to door, Aldous Crane had already begun telling people in town that the Whitfield land was as good as his. He said it the way a man says something he knows is already decided. He said it over coffee at the saloon at the feed store counter outside the post office on a Wednesday morning when half the town was collecting their mail. How was a large man, Aldous Crane, heavy in the shoulders, thick in the middle, with a way of filling a room that had nothing to do with physical space, and everything to do with the understanding that he could cause trouble for anyone who disagreed with him. He owned the lumber mill. He owned 3 buildings on the main street. He had 2 sons who did his errands and asked no questions. He had been looking at the Whitfield land for years. Her father's death had simply given him the opening he needed. It was Margaret Holt who had mentioned Cade Merritt. Margaret was 63 years old, had outlived 2 husbands and a business partner, and had very little patience for what she called the particular stupidity of men who mistake legal maneuvering for justice. She ran the dry goods store on the corner of 3rd and Main, and she had known Clara's mother, and she had been one of the few people in Sutter's Crossing who had brought food to Clara's door in the weeks after her father died without being asked. Clara had been sitting in Margaret's back room behind the store going through the letter from Crane for what felt like the 100th time when Margaret set a cup of tea in front of her and said without preamble, "You need to talk to Cade Merritt." Clara had looked up. "Who?" "Ridgeline man. Lives up on the north face above your property line." Margaret sat down across from her. "He knew your father. Not well, but he knew him. And he's had his own business with Aldous Crane." "What kind of business?" "The kind where Crane tried to take something that wasn't his, and Merritt didn't let him." Margaret wrapped both hands around her own cup. 3 years ago, Crane tried to buy up the water rights to the creek that runs through Merritt's land. Merritt found the original territorial survey proved Crane's claim was fraudulent, and took it all the way to the county office without a lawyer, without help, without a single person in this town standing beside him. Clara was quiet for a moment. "And he won. He won. So why doesn't anyone—" She stopped. "Why does everyone talk about him the way they do?" Margaret looked at her steadily. "Because he won against a man most people in this town owe money to, or favors to, or are afraid of. And nobody likes to be reminded that they chose the wrong side." Clara looked down at the letter. "He won't help me," she said. "He doesn't know me." "No," Margaret agreed. "He won't help you for nothing, but there might be a way to make it worth his while." She paused. "His land borders yours on the north side. Crane wants both. If Crane gets yours first, Merritt's is next. He knows that. He's been watching this situation since before your father died." Another pause. "He needs a reason to move. You might be it." "What kind of reason?" Margaret looked at her for a long time. "The kind," she said carefully, "that involves a marriage certificate and a land consolidation agreement that makes both properties legally untouchable by a third party." The silence that followed was long enough that Clara could hear the clock on the wall behind Margaret ticking with the patient indifference of something that has no stake in what happens next. "You're telling me to propose to a man I've never met," Clara said. "I'm telling you it's an option," Margaret said. "I'm not telling you it's a good one. I'm not telling you it won't be the hardest thing you've ever done. I'm telling you it's the option that might actually work." She set down her cup. "Crane is moving fast, Clara. He's already filed a preliminary notice with the county. You have maybe 3 weeks before this goes further than you can stop it." Clara looked at the letter again. She looked at it for a long time. Then she folded it, put it in her coat pocket, and stood up. "How do I find him?" she said. The ride up the mountain had taken most of a morning. The trail was narrow and steep, and the summer heat pressed down through the pines in a way that made the air feel thick. Her horse, a roan mare named Bess, who had been her father's before she was Clara's, picked her way carefully over the loose rock with the practiced calm of an animal who has learned that panic is rarely useful. Clara had not felt calm. She had rehearsed what she was going to say about 14 times on the way up. Each version sounded worse than the one before it. By the time the cabin appeared through the trees, low and solid built of squared timber, with a porch that faced the valley she had abandoned, rehearsing entirely, and decided to simply say what was true. She dismounted, tied Bess to the post at the edge of the clearing, walked to the door. She knocked. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the door opened. Cade Merritt was not what she had expected. She had prepared herself for something rougher, something more visibly frightening, a man who looked the way the rumors sounded. What she found instead was a man in his late 30s, lean but broad in the shoulder, with dark hair going a little long at the collar, and eyes so pale a gray they were almost silver. He was in a work shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, and he had clearly been in the middle of something because he held a piece of leather harness in one hand and was looking at her with an expression she couldn't immediately read. Not hostile, not welcoming, something in between. "You're George Whitfield's daughter," he said. It wasn't a question. "Clara Whitfield," she said. "Yes, sir." He looked at her for another moment. Then he stepped back and held the door open. "Come in," he said. The inside of the cabin was nothing like she'd imagined. She didn't know exactly what she had imagined, something spare and grim. Maybe something that matched what people said about the man who lived there. What she found was a space that was spare, yes, but not grim. There were bookshelves along one wall, crowded enough that volumes had begun to be stacked horizontally on top of vertical ones. There was a work table near the window, with tools laid out in a careful order, she recognized as the order of a man who knew exactly where everything was. There was a wood stove that was clearly well maintained, and a braided rug in front of it that had seen better days, but was still there, which meant someone had kept it. There were also, on a low shelf beside the back door, 3 ceramic bowls that had clearly been recently washed and set out to dry. Each one had a small chip or crack on the rim that had been carefully repaired with something dark pine pitch maybe, so that the bowl still held its shape. A man who repaired broken things instead of throwing them away. She filed that away without examining why. Merritt had moved to the work table and set down the harness. He picked up a cloth and wiped his hands. "Sit down if you want," he said, nodding toward the 2 chairs by the stove. "You rode a long way." "I'm fine standing." He looked at her. Something shifted in his expression, the faintest suggestion of acknowledgement, as though he'd noticed something and was choosing not to comment on it. "All right," he said. "Then say what you came to say." Clara took the letter from her pocket and held it out. He took it, read it again. His face stayed very still throughout, the kind of stillness that isn't emptiness, but controlled attention. The face of a man who has trained himself not to react until he's sure about what he's reacting to. Then he folded it and handed it back. "Crane," he said. "Yes." "When did this arrive?" 3 weeks after my father died." "And you've been to the lawyer?" "He said it was legal. Fletcher." A slight edge came into his voice on the name. "I'd expect that from Fletcher. He doesn't touch anything Crane is involved in. Not since Crane co-signed a loan for him in 1887. Clara hadn't known that. She filed it away. "Mrs. Holt told me you had experience with Crane," she said. "That you found documents that disproved his claim on your water rights." "I did." "She said Crane is likely to come for your land next once he has mine." A pause. "She's probably right." Clara held his gaze. "Then we have a shared problem." Merritt looked at her steadily. He didn't say anything. She was already beginning to understand a man who believed that silence was only a problem if you couldn't tolerate it. "There's a legal mechanism," she said, "that would consolidate both our properties under a single ownership that Crane couldn't challenge without reopening the original territorial survey from 1873, which would expose him, not us." She took a breath. "It requires both property owners to be related by marriage." The silence that followed was long enough that she heard the wind move through the pines outside and the soft sound of her own heartbeat in her ears. Then Merritt said, "How long have you been carrying that idea around?" "Since Tuesday," she said. 4 days. "And you rode up here today to say it out loud?" "Yes." He turned away from her and walked to the window. He stood there looking out at the valley below for what felt like a considerable amount of time. She didn't press him. She stood exactly where she was, and waited because she had said what was true, and there was nothing more to add to it. Finally he spoke. "I'm not an easy man to live with," he said, still looking out the window. "People will tell you that, and for once they'll be telling the truth. I'm up before sunrise and I work until dark, and I don't talk much when I'm tired." He paused. "This cabin has one bedroom and a storage room that could be made into another. The nearest neighbor is 4 miles down the trail." Clara waited. He turned from the window and looked at her. "If we do this," he said, "it's a business arrangement. You keep your land rights. I keep mine. We file the consolidation paperwork, and we live in the same house until Crane runs out of legal ground to stand on." His eyes were steady on hers. "I won't pretend to feel something I don't, and I won't ask you to. But I give you my word I won't be cruel to you, and in this territory, a man's word is the only thing that outlasts him." Clara looked at him. At the pale gray eyes that were watching her with something that was almost careful. Careful in the way of a man who has learned to be careful about what he extends and to whom. "I have one condition," she said. "Say it." "My father is buried on that property. Whatever happens with the paperwork, with the arrangement, with any of it, nobody touches those graves. Not Crane, not a court, not anybody." Merritt held her gaze. "On my life," he said quietly. Clara nodded once. "Then we have a deal." They were married 4 days later in the Sutter's Crossing Church in front of witnesses who were almost entirely there for the spectacle of it. Reverend Calloway performed the ceremony with the slightly startled manner of a man who had agreed to something before he'd fully thought it through. The women in the third pew whispered throughout. The men near the back stood with their arms crossed, and their expressions ranging from skeptical to openly disapproving. Aldous Crane was not present, but Clara had no doubt he heard about it before the afternoon was out. She wore her mother's wedding dress, which fit her imperfectly, and was 7 years out of fashion, and she stood beside Cade Merritt, who had come down the mountain in clean clothes and a hat. He'd clearly brushed sometime recently, and she said the words she was supposed to say in a voice that didn't tremble because she had decided beforehand that it wasn't going to tremble, and she saw no reason to negotiate with herself about it. Merritt said his words in a voice that was low and even, and carried to the back of the room without effort. When Reverend Calloway said he could kiss his bride, Merritt turned to her with an expression that was, if she had to name it, something like careful respect, and pressed his lips to her forehead briefly, and without ceremony, the way you might acknowledge something that deserved to be acknowledged without making more of it than it was. Several women in the pews audibly reacted. Clara kept her eyes straight ahead. The ride back up the mountain that evening was made in the particular late summer light that turns everything gold for about 40 minutes before the sun finally drops, and they rode side by side, not talking. The horses picking their way up the trail with the evening sounds of the mountains around them. Insects, somewhere a creek running fast over stone, the soft percussion of hooves on packed earth. Merritt had offered to take her bags. She had let him take one, kept the other herself. He hadn't argued. When they reached the cabin, he pushed the door open and stood back for her to enter first. "The storage room is cleared out," he said. "There's a cot in there. I moved it in this morning. It's not—" A pause. "I'll get a proper frame built before the week is out." "The cot is fine," she said. He looked at her. "You sure?" "I've slept on worse." Something moved briefly across his face. She wasn't sure what it was. "There's food on the stove," he said. "Ate earlier, but I left some in case you were hungry from the ride." She was, in fact, very hungry. She hadn't eaten since morning. But she said thank you instead of saying that. She put her bags down beside the storage room door. She turned and looked at him. "Mr. Merritt," she said. "Cade," he said. "If we're going to do this, you might as well use my name." "Cade," she said. It felt strange in her mouth. Not unpleasant, just unfamiliar. "Thank you. For what you're doing. I know this wasn't—" She stopped. Started again. "I know this isn't what either of us would have chosen." He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "But I made worse decisions out of worse reasons. This one at least makes sense." He moved toward the back of the cabin. "Get some food. Sleep if you can. We'll go over the paperwork in the morning." He said goodnight without looking back. She stood in the middle of the cabin that was now technically her home, in the dress that had been her mother's on the night that was technically her wedding night. And then she sat down at the table, put her face in her hands and let herself cry. Not because she was afraid of him. She wasn't anymore. Not because the arrangement was wrong. It was the only logical thing she'd been able to do in 6 weeks of impossible choices. She cried because she was 26 years old, and her father was gone, and her mother was gone, and the only thing left of them was 112 acres of land and 2 cottonwood trees. And she was sitting in a stranger's cabin on a mountain wearing a dress that didn't fit, having just married a man who had shaken her hand after the ceremony instead of saying anything. She cried because she was exhausted. She cried because she was alone. She cried because somewhere in the 4 days between Margaret Holt's back room and this moment, she had held herself so tightly together that she hadn't let herself do it until now, and now there was nobody to see it, which meant she finally could. She cried for about 10 minutes. Then she wiped her face, washed her hands at the basin, and went to see what was in the pot on the stove. It was a beef stew, still warm with potatoes and onions, and a seasoning she couldn't immediately identify, but which was careful. Not fancy, just careful, the kind of thing you make when you've spent enough time cooking alone that you've learned to do it right, because there's no reason not to. She ate 2 bowls. Then she went to bed. She woke before dawn to the sound of an axe. For one disoriented moment, she didn't know where she was. The ceiling was too low. The light was wrong. The morning sounds were not the sounds of the town. Then it came back to her. All of it in the quiet order of a person who has learned to manage themselves in difficult situations. She was on Ridgeline Mountain in Cade Merritt's cabin, which was now also her cabin because she was Cade Merritt's wife. She lay still for a moment listening. The axe was steady. Not rushed, not careless, a rhythm that said the man swinging it knew what he was doing and had been doing it long enough that it required no particular thought. She got up. She dressed. She opened the storage room door and moved into the main room of the cabin, and the first thing she noticed was that there was already coffee on the stove. She looked at it. She poured herself a cup. She stood at the window. Howe was in the clearing to the east side of the cabin, splitting rounds of pine into firewood with the methodical efficiency of a man who accounts for winter in the middle of summer. He was in his work clothes, hat already on, despite the early hour, and his back was to the window, so she could only see the motion of him, the lift and swing, the clean split of wood, the bending and stacking. She drank her coffee and watched him for a moment. Then she went and started making breakfast. When he came in, 20 minutes later, she had eggs and cornbread on the table, and a second cup of coffee poured and waiting. He stopped in the doorway. He looked at the table. He looked at her. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know," she said. "Sit down." He came in. He sat down. He picked up the coffee first. She noted that the way he reached for it before anything else and drank it. Then he said quietly and without particular inflection, "Thank you." "You made the stew," she said. "That's different." "It isn't," she said. "Sit and eat before it gets cold." He ate. She sat across from him with her own plate and ate too. And the silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 people who are still figuring out what they are to each other, but have agreed in the meantime to be decent about it. After a while he said, "I'm riding down to the county office today. I want to file the consolidation paperwork before Crane hears we went through with it and tries to block it." "I'll come with you," she said. "It's a long ride." "I made it yesterday." He looked at her. "So you did," he said. Aldous Crane was standing on the steps of the county building when they arrived. He was a large man. She had seen him before from a distance enough to know the shape of him, but up close he was larger than she'd remembered, and he had the particular quality of certain powerful men of making his size feel like an argument before he'd said a word. He looked at Clara. He looked at Cade. He looked at the papers in Cade's hand. Something moved through his expression. Not surprise exactly, but the specific recalibration of a man who had been expecting to win and has just been told the game changed while he wasn't watching. "Merritt," he said. "Crane." Cade's voice was level. Utterly level, the way a flat stone is level. "I heard you got married." Crane's eyes moved to Clara, and she didn't allow herself to look away from him. I heard you made a deal. He said deal the way some men say mistake. You understand that doesn't change the terms of the loan agreement. No, Cade said. It changes the land designation. Once the consolidation is recorded, the Whitfield parcel becomes part of the merit filing from 1873, which predates your loan agreement by 15 years. He paused. You want to challenge that, you'll need to challenge the original territorial survey. And I don't think you want anybody looking that closely at where your property lines actually came from. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight in it. Crane looked at him for a long time. Then he looked at Clara. You're making a mistake, he said, and it was directed at her. She understood specifically at her, because Cade had been beyond his reach for years, and Clara was the new piece. The softer target, the one he thought he might still move. She took one step forward and looked up at him. My father spent 30 years building something honest, she said, and her voice was steady. She was proud of that. Later, she had never been more aware of her own voice than in that moment, and it held. I'm not going to let you take it, because he trusted a document he shouldn't have. That's done. We filed. And if you come anywhere near that property again, we'll bring everything we have about your survey lines to the county board, and let them decide what's legal and what isn't. Crane looked at her. For a moment, just a moment, she thought she saw something in his eyes. Not respect, not anything so generous as that, but a recognition that she was not what he'd expected, that she was not going to fold. Then he straightened up, settled his hat, and walked past them down the steps without another word. Clara stood on the steps and listened to his boots on the boardwalk and didn't turn around until he was gone. Then she let out a breath. Beside her, Cade Merritt said nothing. But when they turned to go inside, he held the door open for her, and when she passed him, she thought she heard him say something very quiet. So quiet she wasn't entirely sure she'd heard it at all. It sounded like good, just that, good. She didn't say anything back, but she thought about it for the rest of the ride home. That night, sitting at the table with the consolidation receipts spread between them and the lamp burning low, Clara looked across at the man she'd married 4 days and approximately 1 lifetime ago. He was reading one of the documents, his brows slightly drawn, one hand wrapped around the coffee cup that was almost certainly cold by now. He had a habit she was already noticing of forgetting that things got cold when he was reading. She had already reheated his coffee once this evening without being asked, and had watched him drink it without seeming to notice it had been touched. Cade, she said. He looked up. Why did you say yes? She asked. When I came up here with that letter. You didn't know me. You didn't owe me anything. You could have read that letter and told me you were sorry about my father and sent me back down the mountain. He looked at her for a long time. I knew your father, he said. Not well, you said. No, not well. He set the document down. But well enough. He came up here 2 winters ago during a bad stretch. I had 3 calves die in a freeze, and I was short on feed and too proud to say so in town. He paused. Your father rode up with 2 sacks of grain and wouldn't take money for them. Said he'd heard I was running thin and he'd had a good fall. Another pause longer. He stayed for coffee. We talked about the valley. He didn't ask me anything about why I lived up here, or what happened before, or any of the things people usually want to know. He just drank his coffee and talked about the weather and left. Clara felt something move through her chest that she didn't have a name for in that moment. He didn't tell me that, she said. I don't think he would have. Cade picked up the document again. He wasn't the kind of man who did things to be talked about. She looked at him. No, she said. He wasn't. The lamp burned. The mountains were quiet outside. Clara looked down at the papers on the table at her name, and his name written together in the county clerk's careful hand. And she thought about what it meant to be a person who showed up with grain for a stranger and asked nothing for it, and what it meant to be a person who remembered that for 2 years, and then when his daughter showed up in trouble, said yes. She didn't say any of that. She picked up her pen and initialed the bottom of the last page where the clerk had marked it. Get some sleep, Cade said without looking up from his reading. We've got fence work on the north line tomorrow, and the summer grass won't wait. Good night, Cade, she said. He nodded once. She went to bed. She did not cry that night. The fence on the north line was worse than Cade had let on. Clara found that out at first light when she followed him up the ridge with a coil of wire over her shoulder and a pair of work gloves she'd found hanging on a peg by the back door. He hadn't told her to come. He hadn't told her not to. He had simply picked up his tools, walked out, and she had followed, and he hadn't said a word about it. The first section of fence was down entirely, posts pulled out of the ground wire lying flat in the summer grass, like something had gone through it deliberately. Cade crouched down and examined the nearest post. He turned it over in his hands. Then he set it down without comment. "That didn't fall," Clara said. "No," he said. "It didn't." "Someone pulled it." "Yes." She looked down the line. 3 more sections were down. Maybe 4. She couldn't see the end of it from where she stood. "Crane," she said. Cade stood. He had a way of standing that was very still, not tense, but gathered the way a man stands when he's made a decision about himself and doesn't need to revisit it. "Can't prove that," he said. "But the timing's right." "What do we do?" He picked up the post. "We fix it," he said. "1 section at a time." So they fixed it. Clara had never repaired fence before. She said so plainly because she had already understood that Cade Merritt did not have patience for pretending, and pretending competence she didn't have would waste both their time. He showed her once how to set the post, how to run the wire, how to use the tensioning tool so the line went tight without snapping. Then he let her do it. She made mistakes. He corrected them without raising his voice and without making anything of it beyond the correction itself. The 3rd time she got it right, he didn't say so out loud, but he moved on to the next section without double-checking her work, and she understood that was the same thing. They worked through the morning. The summer heat built slowly the way it does in the mountains, not the flat pressing heat of the valley, but something that came in layers, the air thin enough that she felt it in her lungs when she worked fast. By mid-morning her back was aching, and her hands were raw inside the gloves, and she had sweat through her work shirt. She didn't stop. Neither did he. Around midday, they sat on the ground at the end of a finished section and ate the bread and dried meat she'd wrapped in cloth before they left. He handed her a canteen without being asked, and she drank and handed it back. 7 sections, she said. 8, he said. There's 1 more past that stand of birch. She looked. Then she looked back at him. Someone wanted to make a point. Crane's been making points for years. He pulls a fence here. He moves a survey marker there. He sends his boys to have a quiet conversation with someone's hired hand. He took a drink from the canteen. He doesn't do anything you can take to court. Just enough to make people tired. Has it worked on you? He looked at her sideways. I'm still here, he said. She thought about that for a moment. About what it meant to stay somewhere when everything around you was designed to make you leave. About what kind of person held their ground. Not because they had something to prove, but because they had simply decided that this was where they belonged and were not going to be argued out of it. He didn't expect this, she said. The consolidation. He thought I'd fold. Most people would have, Cade said. Not unkindly. As a statement of fact. My father didn't raise me to fold, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, no, I don't reckon he did. They went back to work. Bam. It was on the ride back down that they saw the rider. He was coming up the trail from the direction of town. Not the main trail, but the secondary one that cut across the lower pasture, the one that wasn't widely known. Clara noticed Cade's posture change before she'd fully registered the man. A slight shift, a gathering of attention that had nothing to do with alarm and everything to do with the particular alertness of someone who has learned to read the space around him. The rider pulled up when he saw them. He was younger than Clara had expected, maybe 19 or 20, with the kind of face that hadn't yet learned to hide what it was feeling. He was dusty from the road, and he had his hat in his hands, which she took as either nervousness or respect, and couldn't yet tell which. Mr. Merritt, he said. Cade said nothing, just looked at him. My name's Tommy Reeves. My family's got the... He stopped, started again. We're the family on the south end of the valley, the Reeves place. I know it, Cade said. My pa sent me up. The boy's jaw tightened. Crane's men came by yesterday. Said we owe back rent on a water easement we've had for 20 years. Said if we don't pay up by the end of the month, they're going to reroute the creek access. Clara felt something go very still inside her chest. Cade looked at the boy for a long time. "Your pa got his original easement papers," he said. "Yes, sir. We got them." "Bring them to me," Cade said. "Don't talk to Fletcher. Don't talk to Crane. Don't sign anything anybody puts in front of you. Just bring me the papers." Tommy Reeves nodded. Then he looked at Clara, not impolitely, but with the frank curiosity of a young man who had heard something in town and couldn't quite reconcile it with what he was looking at. "Is it true you two got married?" he said. "Yes," Clara said. He nodded slowly, as though this answered a question he hadn't known he had. "People in town are saying—" He stopped himself. "I know what people in town are saying," Clara said. "Bring your father's papers." Tommy put his hat back on, tipped it to her with the awkward sincerity of someone doing something they'd been taught but hadn't yet made their own, and rode back down the trail. Clara watched him go. Then she turned to find Cade watching her. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. But there was something in the way he said it, some small, precise quality of attention that hadn't quite been there before, and she filed that away, the same way she'd been filing everything away since she arrived on this mountain building a picture of a man, one detail at a time. 3 days after the fence repair, Margaret Holt rode up the mountain. Clara heard the horse first and came to the door, and the sight of Margaret dismounting in front of the cabin, solid and unhurried in her dark traveling dress, with her silver hair pinned back firmly, was so unexpectedly welcome that Clara felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't realized was tight. "You look better than I expected," Margaret said by way of greeting. "I feel better than I expected," Clara said honestly. "Come inside." Margaret came inside. She looked around the cabin with the candid assessment of a woman who has been in many people's homes and draws her conclusions quickly. Then she sat down at the table and accepted the coffee Clara poured without comment. "Where's Merritt?" "Down at the lower pasture. There's a section of the grazing land he wants to reseed before the heat gets worse." Margaret wrapped both hands around her cup. "Town is talking." "I know. Crane is talking louder than anybody else." Margaret's voice was level. "He's telling people the marriage is a scheme, that you tricked Merritt into it, that he's using words I won't repeat, but the implication is that you manipulated a lonely man who didn't know what he was agreeing to." Clara looked at her. "And what are people saying back to that?" "Some are believing him." A pause. "Some are not. The Reeves boy told his father what Merritt said about the easement papers, and James Reeves told 4 other families, and at least 2 of them have had their own conversations with Crane's men in the past year that they hadn't spoken about publicly." Margaret looked at her steadily. "Crane's been running the same scheme in 6 different variations for longer than anyone realized. He's patient. He works slowly. He moves one family at a time. But now they're talking to each other," Clara said. "Now they're talking to each other." Margaret confirmed. "Because you gave them a reason to." Clara was quiet for a moment. "I didn't do that," she said. "Cade told the Reeves boy to bring his papers. Merritt would have stayed on his mountain until Crane came for him directly," Margaret said. "He's a man who defends what's his. He wasn't going to go looking for a broader fight." She looked at Clara over the rim of her cup. "You married him. That changed what he was defending." Clara didn't have an answer to that. She sat with it instead. The door opened, and Cade came in, and the shift in the room's atmosphere was the shift that happens when a man who takes up space, not aggressively, not loudly, but simply physically, and in terms of presence, enters a room that had been organized without him in it. He stopped when he saw Margaret. "Mrs. Holt," he said with the polite restraint of a man who trusts certain people precisely and completely. "Merritt." Margaret looked at him with frank appraisal. "You're taking care of her." It was not a question. Clara felt her face go warm at the particular directness of it. Cade looked at Margaret, then at Clara, then back at Margaret. "She doesn't need much taking care of," he said, which was Clara thought either a compliment or a deflection, and might have been both. "Crane is telling people you didn't know what you were agreeing to," Margaret told him. That she manipulated you. Cade was quiet for one moment. Just one. Crane can say what he likes, he said then. I read the agreement before I signed it. I'm not a man who signs things he doesn't understand. Will you say that publicly? Another pause. Shorter this time. If it comes to it. Margaret nodded once, as though that settled something. She finished her coffee, stood up, and picked up her riding gloves from the table. Crane's going to move before the end of summer, she said. He knows the consolidation closes his easement angle. He'll find another one. She looked at both of them. Be ready. Then she left. Clara and Cade stood in the cabin after the sound of Margaret's horse had faded down the trail, and the particular quality of the silence between them was different from the other silences. It had texture to it, weight, the kind of quiet that happens between two people when something has been said in front of them that requires them to look at each other and decide what to do with it. She's right, Clara said. He'll find another angle. I know, Cade said. What do you think it'll be? He moved to the work table and began washing his hands in the basin. He's going to try to discredit the consolidation filing. Claim there was fraud in the process. He dried his hands. He's got a friend on the county board, man named Hargrove. Hargrove's been in Crane's pocket since 1885. Can Hargrove overturn the filing? Not without a hearing, and at a hearing evidence gets presented. He turned and looked at her. I've been collecting documentation on Crane for 3 years. Survey irregularities, deed discrepancies, affidavits from 2 families who were pushed off their land in 1886. A beat. I wasn't ready to use it. I didn't have enough, and I didn't have anyone who would stand up in a room and say it out loud with me. Clara understood then something she had been circling around for days without quite arriving at. You weren't just helping me because of my father, she said. Cade looked at her. No, he said after a moment. I wasn't only that. You needed someone who would stand next to you. He didn't answer immediately. He had a way of weighing things before he said them, not stalling, not evasion, but genuine consideration, as though he believed words were worth getting right. I've been on this mountain alone for 3 years, he said finally. I can defend my own land. I can't change what Crane's been doing to this valley by myself. He paused. When you came up here with that letter, I saw a woman who wasn't going to fold and wasn't going to be quiet about it. Another pause. That's not a common thing. Clara looked at him. You could have told me that, she said. I'm telling you now. She thought about that. About the fact that he'd made a decision about her the day she came up the mountain with that letter. A decision that had more layers to it than she'd understood at the time. About the fact that she had made a decision about him too. Standing in a lawyer's office looking at papers she hadn't wanted to look at and thinking this man held his ground against Crane once. He's still here. All right, she said. He nodded. And that was that. Tommy Reeves came back 2 days later with his father's easement papers, and with him came James Reeves himself, a weathered man in his 50s, with the careful dignity of someone who is not accustomed to asking for help, and is doing it anyway because the situation has moved past his ability to manage alone. He sat at the table in the cabin and spread the papers out, and Cade sat across from him and went through them with the thoroughness of a man who has spent 3 years learning how documents work from the inside, what they actually say versus what people assume they say, where the language is designed to mislead how a sentence can appear to mean one thing and be structured to mean something else. Clara made coffee and sat at the end of the table and listened. She was good at listening. She had understood early that listening was not passive. It was a form of attention that required you to track, not only what was said, but the shape of the silences around it, what people circled around, rather than approaching directly what they said loudly to cover what they were quiet about. What she heard listening to James Reeves talk was a man who had known something was wrong for 2 years and had not spoken because he had no one to speak to who would believe him and not be afraid of the consequences. When Cade finished with the papers, he looked up. Your easement is sound, he said. The original grant is from the territorial period. Crane's claim against it has no legal basis. James Reeves let out a breath that seemed to come from somewhere much deeper than his lungs. I knew it, he said, and his voice had the particular roughness of a man who has been holding something for a long time and has just been told he can put it down. "But," Cade said, and Reeves stiffened. "Crane's going to keep pushing. A legal claim won't stop him, he knows that. Even if you have the papers, most people can't afford to fight it in court, and he's counting on that. He's counting on you to fold before it gets that far." "Then what do we do?" Cade looked at Clara. She hadn't expected that. The look wasn't asking permission. It was something else, something that took her a moment to identify. He was checking whether she was ready, whether she wanted to say it, or whether she wanted him to. "You talk to the other families," she said. "The ones Crane's been working on. You pool the documentation. You go to the county board together, not one at a time where he can pick you off, but all of you with everything all at once, so that the thing he's been building for years is visible in a single room at a single time." She paused. "He's only been able to do this because everyone's been dealing with it alone. Make it impossible to deal with alone." James Reeves looked at her. Then he looked at Cade. "She figured this out," he said. "She came up with most of it," Cade said without inflection. Reeves looked back at Clara. "Your father was a good man," he said. "I went to his funeral. I didn't speak because I'm not good with words at funerals, but I went." Clara felt the familiar pressure behind her eyes and pushed it back. "Thank you," she said. "You tell me what you need," Reeves said. "I'll talk to the Murphys and the Hendersons and the Garza family. The Garza brothers lost a parcel in '87 that nobody ever explained properly." He stood up and gathered his papers. "When do you want to move?" Cade looked at Clara again. 3 weeks, she said. "We need 3 weeks to get everything organized." Reeves nodded. He put his hat on. He looked at them both standing there at the table in the mountain cabin, and something in his expression shifted a recognition, maybe, of what this actually was. Not just a legal strategy. Something that had been needed in this valley for a long time, and hadn't been possible until two people who were very different from each other, and from everyone's expectations, had ended up for reasons that had nothing to do with ease or comfort standing side by side. 3 weeks, he said, and left. That evening, Clara found the book. She hadn't meant to look through the shelves. She had been reaching for a candle from the shelf near the window, and her hand had touched a spine and dislodged it. And when she picked it up, she found it wasn't a book she'd have expected. It was a volume of poetry. Old battered, the cover nearly worn through at the corners, the spine held together with a piece of sinew that someone had run through 2 small holes at the top and bottom. She opened it. Inside the front cover, in a handwriting that was not Cade's. She had seen his handwriting on the consolidation paperwork, and this was different, rounder, and more deliberate were the words, "For Cade who sees more than he says. E." She stood there for a moment holding the book. Then she put it back exactly where it had been. She didn't say anything about it that night, but the next morning when she was making breakfast and he came in from the early chores, she set his coffee down and said without turning from the stove, "You've got good books." A pause. "Some of them," he said. "The poetry shelf especially." The silence that followed was different from other silences. She didn't turn around for it. She kept her back to him and let the eggs do what eggs do, and she heard him sit down, and then she heard him pick up his coffee, and then he said in a voice that had something careful and deliberate in it, "My mother's. She used to read to me when I was a boy." A beat. "I kept the ones she marked." Clara put the eggs on the plate. She turned and brought them to the table and set them down in front of him. "She had good taste," she said. He looked at her. "Yes," he said. "She did." She sat across from him. They ate. And the silence this particular morning had something in it that hadn't been there before, some quality of thaw of two people who have been keeping a careful distance, discovering that the distance has gotten shorter without either of them deciding to move. Dull. The trouble came in the 10th day. She found out from Tommy Reeves, who came up the trail at a near gallop just before noon, with his hat crooked and his horse lathered, and the particular expression of a young man who has been sent ahead of bad news. "Crane filed a formal complaint with the county board," he said barely off the horse. "He says the consolidation was done fraudulently. He says—" The boy stopped. His jaw worked. "He says you lied about the nature of the marriage. Says it's not a real marriage. Says you told the clerk it was a full legal union, when it wasn't because it wasn't consummated." The word landed in the air between them, with the weight of something that had been designed to be precisely this uncomfortable. Cade was very still. Clara was very still. Tommy looked mortified. "I'm just the messenger, ma'am, Mr. Merritt. I'm just—" "I know," Clara said. "Thank you, Tommy. Can you give us a moment?" Tommy retreated gratefully toward the horses. Clara looked at Cade. Cade looked at Clara. "He found someone to talk," she said. "Hargrove," Cade said. "It's Hargrove. He's got access to the clerk's confidential filing notes. Someone in that office told Crane—" He stopped. "It doesn't matter how he found out," Clara said, and her voice was steadier than she felt. "What matters is whether it gives him legal standing to challenge the filing." "It might," Cade said, "depending on how the original territorial law reads on the definition of a valid marital consolidation." His jaw was tight. "I need to check the statute." "Check it," she said. "I'll deal with Tommy." He went inside. She walked over to where Tommy was standing with the horses, and she looked at the boy, and she said, "What's Crane planning to do with this?" "He's calling a public hearing," Tommy said. "He wants the county board to convene and review the filing. He's telling people around town that you used Merritt, that you took advantage of him, that Merritt didn't understand what he was agreeing to." He looked genuinely distressed. "He said it in front of my father, and my father near came apart over it. Said Merritt was a fool and you were worse." Clara felt the anger move through her. Not the hot, chaotic kind, but the cold, precise kind that comes when someone says something that is designed specifically to diminish someone who doesn't deserve to be diminished. "What did your father say back?" she asked. Tommy's chin came up. "Said he'd never known Cade Merritt to be a fool about anything in his life, and he'd stand up in public and say so." Something in Clara's chest settled. "Good," she said. "Tell your father we'll need him to." She went back inside. Cade was at the table with the statute open in front of him. He had the relevant territorial law in a document binder she hadn't known existed, which told her something about how long he'd been preparing for something like this. "Well," she said. He looked up. His expression was controlled. "The law is ambiguous," he said. "Under strict reading, a marital consolidation requires evidence of shared habitation and marital intent. The consummation question is a gray area." He paused. "Hargrove knows this. He's not going to rule on the law, he's going to rule on appearances. He's going to make it embarrassing enough that neither of us wants to fight it publicly." "He's wrong about that," Clara said. Cade looked at her. "He's counting on us being ashamed," she said. "He's counting on me being ashamed of a marriage that isn't what people expect, and on you being ashamed because he's calling you a fool. He wants us to go quiet." She met his gaze directly. "I'm not going quiet." Cade was still for a moment. Something moved in those pale gray eyes, something she'd learned in 10 days to pay attention to, because it didn't appear often, and it meant something when it did. "Neither am I," he said. "Then we go to the hearing," she said. "And we take the Reeves family and the Murphys and whoever else James Reeves has talked to, and we put everything Crane has been doing in that room in front of that board, and we let the truth be the loudest thing anyone hears." Cade looked at her for a long, measured moment. "You know," he said, "when you came up this mountain with that letter, I thought you were desperate." "I was desperate," she said. "No," he said quietly. "Desperate people look for someone to solve their problem. You came up here with a solution. You just needed a second signature." She looked at him. She didn't know what to do with that exactly, with the precision of it, with the fact that in 10 days this man had seen her more accurately than people who had known her for years. "The hearing," she said. "The hearing," he agreed. Outside, Tommy Reeves was waiting with the news from town, and somewhere down in the valley, Aldous Crane was making calculations he believed were in his favor, and the summer heat pressed down over Ridgeline Mountain with the particular indifference of weather that does not care what is at stake. Clara picked up her coat from the peg by the door. Cade reached past her and held it open. She put it on. They walked out together. The county board hearing was set for a Thursday. That gave them 11 days. Cade spent the first 3 of those days riding. Not up the mountain, not down to town across the valley from one family to the next. covering ground that Clara hadn't known. He knew this well. He knew which families had well water and which depended on creek access. He knew which parcels backed up against Crane's timber holdings and which were hemmed in by the road easements Crane had quietly acquired over the years. He knew this valley the way a man knows something he has been watching carefully for a long time without being able to do anything about it. Clara knew this because she rode with him. He hadn't invited her the first morning. He had simply not told her not to come, and she had learned by now that with Cade Merritt, that was as close to an invitation as she was likely to get. She saddled Bess while he saddled his roan, and they rode out together, and he briefed her on each family before they arrived. Not gossip, not speculation, but the relevant facts stated plainly, so that she would know what she was walking into. The Murphys had lost a parcel in 1888 to a deed challenge they couldn't afford to fight. The Garza brothers had signed a water-sharing agreement in 1886 that had seemed reasonable and had slowly been restructured over 3 years into something that was nearly a lease. One more signature away from giving Crane effective control of their irrigation. The Henderson family had a verbal agreement with Crane's father going back to the 1870s that had never been put in writing, and Crane Jr. had spent 5 years quietly establishing a paper record that contradicted it. Each one a different mechanism. Each one the same strategy. At the Murphy place, the oldest son, a man named Patrick, who was perhaps 40, with the careful eyes of someone who had been lied to enough times to treat every new development with suspicion, listened to. Cade spoke for about 3 minutes and then held up a hand. "What do you want from us?" he said. "Come to the hearing," Cade said. "Bring every document you have, every letter, every deed, every agreement. And if Crane comes after us for it." "He's already coming after you," Clara said. "He's been coming after you for 2 years. The only difference is that so far you've been dealing with it alone." Patrick Murphy looked at her. His expression was not unfriendly, but it was measuring the look of a man who is deciding whether a person has earned the right to say a true thing to him. "You're the Whitfield girl," he said. "Clara Merritt," she said, and felt for the first time the weight of that name, not as a burden, but as a fact, a piece of ground she was standing on. Patrick Murphy looked at her for another moment. Then he looked at his brother, who was standing in the doorway, and something passed between them that was years old and required no words. "We'll be there," Patrick said. By the 5th day, they had commitments from 7 families. By the 7th, it was 11. On the 8th day, Clara went back down to Margaret's store. She had a list. She needed Margaret to look at it. Not the legal strategy Cade had that under control, but the human piece of it. Who in that room was going to be watching, and what were they going to be watching for? Who were the board members beyond Hargrove, and what did they care about? How many people in Sutter's Crossing had a reason to want Crane stopped that they hadn't yet admitted to themselves? Margaret looked at the list for a long time. Then she looked up. "Hargrove is not the problem," she said. "Hargrove is predictable. He'll do what Crane tells him, and everyone knows it. The problem is Whitmore, the second board member. He's not in Crane's pocket, but he's afraid of him. There's a difference." Margaret set the list down. "Whitmore cares about 2 things: the appearance of fairness and not being personally embarrassed. If you can give him a reason to vote against Crane that doesn't require courage, he'll take it." "What kind of reason?" "Evidence so clear that voting to ignore it would make him look like a fool." Margaret paused. "Not a participant in corruption, a fool. That's what he can't tolerate." Clara thought about that. "Cade has the survey documents," she said. "The irregularities in Crane's property boundaries. Are they clear enough for a man who doesn't want to understand them anyway?" "I'll make them clear enough," Clara said. Margaret looked at her with the expression she sometimes wore, not quite a smile, but the particular quality of attention that meant she was seeing something she approved of. "Your mother would have liked to see this," she said. Clara didn't answer. She couldn't for a moment. "Go," Margaret said, not unkindly. "You've got work to do." On the 9th day, Crane sent men to the cabin, not his sons. 2 men Clara didn't recognize, hired, she thought, because there was something performative about their arrival, something that was designed to be noticed. They came in the middle of the morning, when the light was high and clear, and there was no ambiguity about who was approaching or from which direction. Cade was in the pasture. Clara was at the work table with the survey documents spread out cross-referencing the irregularities she'd marked against the county grid Cade had sketched out from memory. She heard the horses. She went to the door. The two men stopped at the edge of the clearing. The one in front, older with a flat effect that wasn't quite boredom and wasn't quite menace, but lived somewhere between them, touched the brim of his hat. "Ma'am," he said, "we're looking for your husband." "He's not available," Clara said. "We'll wait." "No," she said, "you won't." She came forward 2 steps and stopped with her hands at her sides. "You're on posted land and you weren't invited here. If you have business with my husband, you can put it in writing and send it through the county clerk's office." The man looked at her with the slight recalibration of someone who had expected less from her. "Mr. Crane wants to extend an offer," he said. "A fair buyout of both properties at market value. It's a generous offer, ma'am. More than fair." "Tell Mr. Crane," Clara said, "that there is no price for my father's land. Tell him we'll see him Thursday." The man looked at her for another moment. "You understand," he said, and his voice dropped just slightly, "that the hearing is not going to go the way you're planning." "I'll take my chances," she said. He held her gaze for one more beat. Then he turned his horse and rode back down the trail without another word, and his partner followed. Clara stood and watched them go until they were out of sight and started shaking. She looked down at them. These hands that had been completely steady while the men were there and were now trembling with the delayed arrival of what her body had understood was happening, even while her mind was keeping it at a manageable distance. She pressed them flat against her thighs and breathed. "They're gone." Cade's voice came from behind her. She hadn't heard him come up. She turned. He was standing at the edge of the porch, still holding the fence post he'd been carrying. He was looking at her with that careful, measured attention, the same look she'd seen him give the fence line the first morning, the look that assessed without judgment. "I know," she said. "You handled that right." "My hands are shaking," she said. "I know," he said. "That's not weakness. That's what happens after." He set the post down. "Come inside. I'll make coffee." She followed him in. He made coffee without ceremony, the way he did most things with a competence that didn't announce itself. She sat at the table and spread her hands flat on the survey documents and waited for the trembling to stop. After a moment, he set a cup in front of her and sat down across. "Crane sent them to rattle you," he said. "I know." "Did it work?" She looked up at him. "It worked a little," she said. "I'm rattled a little." Something in his expression shifted. Not softened exactly. Cade Merritt's face didn't soften in the way that phrase usually meant. But the quality of his attention changed, moved towards something that was warmer than his default and more direct. "Good," he said. "Means you're paying attention." "That's a strange way to look at it. Man who can't be rattled isn't thinking about what's real," he said. "You were scared, and you said what needed to be said anyway." He looked at her steadily. "That's the only kind of courage that counts." Clara looked at him. She thought about that for the rest of the day. The night before the hearing, she couldn't sleep. She lay on the cot in the small room Cade had built the proper frame 2 weeks ago, as promised, and she had a real mattress now, which she had not commented on, because she understood that commenting on it would mean acknowledging that he had done something kind, and he would find that awkward. And she stared at the ceiling and went through every document in her head. Every affidavit, every survey number, every family name, and every piece of their story that was going to be laid out in that room tomorrow. She heard him moving in the main room. She wasn't surprised. She didn't think he slept particularly well on any night, but on this one, she would have been shocked if he did. She got up, put on her coat over her nightdress, opened the door. He was at the table with a lamp reading not the legal documents he had those memorized. The poetry book. He looked up when she came out. "Can't sleep," she said. Not a question. Neither an apology. "No," he said. He looked at the book in his hands for a moment, then closed it. "Sit down if you want." She sat. For a while, neither of them said anything. The lamp burned. Somewhere outside an owl called and didn't call again. "Tell me about before," she said. He looked at her. "Before you came up the mountain," she said. "You don't have to. I'm not asking for anything you don't want to say. But we've been living in the same house for 2 weeks, and tomorrow we're going to stand in a room together and ask 11 families to trust us. And I feel like I know your work and your habits and your coffee preference and almost nothing about who you were before all this." He was quiet for a moment. "What do you want to know?" he said. "The woman," she said. "The one who left. People talk about her." The lamp flame moved in a draft from somewhere. He watched it. "Her name was Nora," he said. "We were together 3 years. She was from the valley, a town girl not suited for the mountain." He paused. "I knew that. I knew it from the start, and I kept thinking it would change. That what was between us would be enough to make it work." He was quiet for a moment. "It wasn't. She left the territory in 1886. I don't blame her. Do you miss her?" He considered the question with the same care he gave everything. "I missed what I thought it was going to be," he said. "I'm not sure that's the same as missing her." Another pause. "After she left, I decided that was the last time I was going to put someone in a situation I knew wasn't right for them and call it love." Clara absorbed that. "Is that why you came up the mountain?" "Partly." He looked at the book. "Partly I came up here because the valley was getting smaller and louder, and I needed to think." He turned the book over in his hands. "I stayed because it was honest up here. What you see is what's real. The weather doesn't pretend. The animals don't pretend. The work is exactly what it is." "Do you get lonely?" she asked. He looked at her, and for a moment, just a moment, the careful distance that he kept around himself, like a coat he'd been wearing so long, he'd stopped noticing it was there, went thin, and she saw through it to whatever was underneath a man who had told himself a story about solitude and had been living inside that story long enough that he'd stopped questioning whether it was true. "Yes," he said. "I get lonely." She didn't say anything to that. She didn't have anything to say that wouldn't be too much or too little. So she just sat with it and let it be what it was, which was the truest thing he'd said to her since she'd knocked on his door with a letter in her hand. After a while he said, "You should sleep." "So should you." "I'll sleep when the hearing's done." She stood, picked up her coat, paused at the door of the small room. "Cade," she said. He looked up. "Whatever happens tomorrow," she said, "you didn't do this alone. I want you to know I understand that. What it cost you to open that door when I knocked." He looked at her for a long moment. "What it cost you to knock," he said quietly. She went back to bed. She didn't sleep well, but she slept. The hearing room in Sutter's Crossing was the back room of the town hall, and it was already full when Clara and Cade arrived on Thursday morning. Full was not the word she'd expected. She had expected 12-15 people, the families they'd contacted, maybe a handful of curious bystanders. What she found was every seat taken and people standing 3 deep along the walls, because word had gotten out in the way that word gets out in small communities where news travels faster than horses and arrives with its own momentum. She felt the room before she saw all of it, the particular quality of a crowd that is divided, half watching, with the wary solidarity of people who have come to see something decided that affects them, and half watching with the particular attention of people who have come to see someone fail. Aldous Crane was already there, seated at the front table, with Fletcher the lawyer beside him, and 2 other men she didn't recognize on his other side. He looked at them when they entered. He nodded once at Cade, the nod of a man who is acknowledging an opponent's arrival without granting him anything by it. Cade didn't nod back. He guided Clara to the table on the opposite side, with one hand briefly at the back of her elbow. Not possessive, not performative. Just the kind of gesture a man makes when he's accounted for the space around him and wants to ensure something moves through it safely. And then he sat down and opened his document binder and became very still. The 3 board members took their seats. Hargrove in the middle, a thin man in a good suit with the expression of someone who has already decided and is performing the deliberation as a courtesy to appearances. Whitmore on the right, broader, more cautious with a pen, he kept picking up and putting down. The third, a woman named Adele Prescott, who ran the schoolhouse, sat on the left with her hands folded and her face giving away nothing. Clara hadn't known there was a woman on the board. She looked at Adele Prescott, and Adele Prescott looked back at her with dark eyes that were sharper than the room deserved. Hargrove called the hearing to order. He laid out the complaint with the professional neutrality of a man who has rehearsed being neutral so many times it has become indistinguishable from dishonesty. Crane's claim was this: the marital consolidation filed by Cade Merritt and Clara Whitfield was fraudulent in nature, constituting a legal marriage in name only entered into for the purpose of circumventing a legitimate debt instrument, and therefore invalid as a basis for the land filing. Fletcher stood and spoke for 12 minutes. He was good at it, she had to give him that. He made the legal language sound like common sense, and common sense sound like inevitability, and inevitability sound like the only responsible outcome for the board to reach. When he sat down, Cade stood. He didn't have Fletcher's smoothness. He didn't try for it. What he had instead was the particular authority of a man who is saying something true and knows it, and who has organized his evidence well enough that the truth can speak without being dressed up. He laid out the survey documents first. He went through the irregularities in Crane's property lines, not technical language, not legal jargon, but plain. This line was moved. This marker was relocated. This document was filed with a date that contradicts the timber record from the same period. He named the families and named the mechanisms. He was methodical, and he was clear, and the room got very quiet while he spoke. Then Clara stood. Hargrove looked surprised. Fletcher looked annoyed. Crane looked for just a moment as though he was recalculating something. "I'd like to speak to the question of the marriage," she said. Hargrove began to say something about procedure. Adele Prescott said quietly but firmly, "Let her speak, Gerald." Hargrove closed his mouth. Clara looked at the room. "Aldous Crane is claiming that this marriage isn't real," she said. "He's claiming that I manipulated a man who didn't understand what he was agreeing to. I'd like you to look at Cade Merritt and tell me, anyone in this room, whether you genuinely believe that's true." A murmur. Not hostile. Something else. "I came up that mountain with a letter and a legal argument and a request," she said. "This man read every document. He asked questions I hadn't thought to ask. He identified a legal mechanism I hadn't known existed. He made a decision based on his own judgment." She paused. "Calling him a fool is not a legal argument. It's an insult. And I'd like the board to note that Crane's entire challenge rests on the premise that Cade Merritt is too simple to know his own mind." She looked directly at Hargrove. "Is that really what this board is prepared to say about a man who's lived on this land for 15 years, paid his taxes, defended his property rights, and never given this county a moment of trouble?" The room was very quiet. Then James Reeves stood up. He had his papers in his hands, and he stood the way a man stands when he has decided to stop being afraid. "I'd like to speak," he said. He wasn't the only one. Patrick Murphy stood after him. Then Elena Garza, the older of the two brothers who Clara hadn't known, was going to speak, but who stood with a dignity that needed no introduction. Then a woman in the back, whose name Clara didn't know, who stood and said, in a voice that carried clearly, "Crane's men told my husband he owed fees on water he's had legal access to for 30 years. I've got the original grant right here." Hargrove tried to call for order twice. The second time, Whitmore put a hand on his arm. "Let them speak, Gerald," Whitmore said, and something in his voice had shifted. He was looking at the room, at the 11 families, at the documents being held up, at the woman in the back, whose voice had not trembled, and he was doing the particular arithmetic of a man who is weighing what he was told to do against what he is looking at. Clara watched him do it. She knew the moment he finished. His pen stopped moving. He set it down. He looked at Hargrove with the expression of a man who has just decided that being associated with something is no longer worth the cost. Crane saw it too. She watched him see it, the slight stiffening, the recalculation running fast behind his eyes. He leaned toward Fletcher and said something in a low voice that she couldn't hear. Fletcher's response was short and tight. Then Crane stood. "I move to withdraw the complaint," he said. The room erupted. Not celebration something rawer than that the sound of people who have been holding something for a long time and have just been told they can stop. Voices overlapping. James Reeves gripping his son's arm, Elena Garza saying something in rapid Spanish to her brother Margaret Holt, who had come in quietly and stood at the back and said nothing until now, letting out a long breath that was almost a laugh. Hargrove looked relieved. Whitmore looked at the table. Adele Prescott looked at Clara with the same sharp dark eyes, and then she did something she hadn't done once during the entire proceeding. She nodded. Just once. Clara nodded back. Crane left through the side door. Clara saw him go. She watched him push through the door at the side of the hall with Fletcher behind him and the two hired men behind Fletcher, and she thought he is not done. She knew it with the particular certainty of knowing something before you have evidence for it. A man like Aldous Crane did not withdraw a complaint and consider himself finished. He withdrew a complaint and went somewhere else and came up with something new. She turned to say that to Cade. He wasn't at the table. She looked around the room. He wasn't near the door. He wasn't with the Reeves family who were talking rapidly to the Murphys. He wasn't by the wall. She moved through the room quickly, pressing past people who wanted to stop her saying brief words to brief hands, and came out of the front door of the hall into the open air. I was standing at the edge of the boardwalk, looking down the street in the direction Crane had gone. His hat was in his hands. She came and stood beside him. "He's not finished," she said. "No," Cade said. "He's not." "What's he going to do?" Cade was quiet for a moment. "I don't know yet, but he's not going to challenge the legal documents again. Not today, not with that room watching. He's going to go around it." He turned his hat over in his hands. "He's going to come for something we didn't put in the documents." She thought about that. "What didn't we put in the documents?" He looked at her. "The mountain itself," he said. "The north face. There's a water source up there, a spring that feeds 3 of the creek systems in the valley. I've known about it for years. I didn't put it in the consolidation filing because it's on ground that's never been formally surveyed. And if Crane surveys it first, he can file a separate claim, one that has nothing to do with our consolidation." He put his hat back on. "If he gets to that spring, he doesn't need our land. He controls the water for the whole valley, regardless of who owns what." Clara stood absolutely still for a moment. "How fast can he move?" she said. "He's got men and money," Cade said. "If he sent someone up there today, then we need to get there first," she said. He looked at her. "It's a 2-hour ride up the north face. Hard ground. The trail isn't safe after dark, and the weather's been building all afternoon." She looked at the sky. The clouds to the west were the particular color and density of a summer mountain storm in the hours before it arrives. Not dramatic yet, but committed. "How long do we have?" she said. 4 hours, maybe 5. "Then we have enough time," she said. "Clara." "We have enough time," she said again. "Let's go." For one moment, he looked at her with an expression she'd seen exactly once before, the night he'd read the poetry book, and she'd come out and asked about Nora, and he'd answered without the usual distance. The expression of a man who is surprised, and who is not used to being surprised, and who is not entirely unhappy about it. Then he put his hat down and said, "I'll get the horses." They rode hard. The trail up the north face of Ridgeline was steeper than the cabin trail switchbacks cut into rock-loose shale in the upper sections where the tree cover thinned, and the footing got unreliable. Cade led and she followed, and she pushed Bess harder than she normally would have, because the clouds to the west were moving faster than she'd hoped, and the light was already going gold and thick the way it does in the hour before a storm. They were an hour up the trail when she heard the other horses. Not behind them. Below and to the west, coming up a parallel route she hadn't known existed through the timber on the far side of the ridge. She pulled up beside Cade. "You hear that?" "Yes." His voice was flat. "There's an old logging cut on the west side. Crane's men know it. They're going to get there before us." "Maybe," he said. And then he turned his horse off the trail and went straight up the ridge. Not a trail. Bare rock and summer grass, steep enough that she felt Bess shift her weight back on her haunches, picking her way with the focused intensity of an animal who has decided to trust the person on her back. Clara didn't second-guess it. She followed. They came over the top of the ridge at a point she wouldn't have found in a month of looking a saddle between two rock outcroppings that opened out onto a small flat of grass above the tree line, and there in the center of that flat was the spring. A seep of clear water coming up through fractured granite pooling in a natural basin, running off in three thin lines that she could see spreading downhill in different directions. 3 creek systems. From one source. She understood looking at it exactly what it meant. Whoever controlled this controlled more of the valley's water than any land deed could. Below them on the west slope, she could hear the horses getting closer. Cade dismounted. I went to his saddlebag and pulled out a rolled document. She recognized it from the night before he'd been writing something at the table after she went to bed, and she hadn't asked what it was. "What is that?" she said. "A survey claim," he said. "Prepared last night. Date and location of the spring witnessed, signature physical markers." He looked around quickly and then walked to a specific point on the north edge of the basin and crouched down. He pulled a metal stake from inside his coat, set it against the rock, and drove it in with 3 hard strikes of a small hammer that had also been in his coat. He had prepared for this. He had known or suspected, and he had prepared for it while she was lying on her cot, unable to sleep, and he had not told her because he'd been protecting the possibility, not keeping a secret, but not putting hope in front of something that might not happen. "Cade," she said. "One more," he said, and moved to the east edge. The horses below were very close now. She could hear voices, 2 men, she thought maybe 3. He drove the second stake. He stood. He came back to where she stood with the document in his hand, and he looked at her with that pale gray gaze that she had been learning to read for 2 weeks, and now in this moment read clearly, steady, resolved, present. "Witness," he said, and held the document out. She took the pen he offered. She signed where he pointed. He signed beside her. Then the first of Crane's men came over the western edge of the ridge. He pulled up short when he saw them. Behind him 2 more men came up and also stopped. The 3 of them looked at Clara and Cade standing beside the spring. They looked at the stakes. The first man, not someone she recognized, but someone with the particular look of a man who has just arrived, somewhere expecting to find it empty, and has not looked at the document in Cade's hand. "You're too late," Cade said. The man looked at him for a long moment. Then the clouds to the west opened up and the rain came down, sudden and absolute, the way mountain summer rain comes. And the man pulled his hat brim down against it and looked at his partners and looked back at Cade. "Crane's not going to like this," he said. "Crane doesn't have to like it," Cade said. "He has to live with it." Clara stood in the rain with water running off the brim of her hat and the signed document clutched to her chest under her coat to keep it dry, and she felt the cold of it and the weight of it and the particular quality of a thing that has just been decided. The 3 men turned their horses around. Cade looked at Clara. "You're soaked," he said. "So are you," she said. He almost smiled. It wasn't quite a smile. It was the thing just before a smile, the last moment before a man who has forgotten how to do something remembers that he used to know. "We need to get off this ridge before the lightning starts," he said. "I know," she said. She didn't move yet. "Thank you," she said. "For last night, for preparing this." She looked at the stake in the rock rain running over the metal in thin sheets. "You were thinking about the whole valley. I was thinking about the spring," he said. "Same thing," she said. He looked at her, and standing there in the summer mountain rain above the valley, he had been defending alone for 3 years. Cade Merritt looked at the woman who had knocked on his door with a letter in her hand and a decision already made, and something in the careful construction he'd been maintaining around himself shifted, not collapsed, not dramatically, but moved. Like a door that has been closed a long time and has just been opened an inch. Enough to let the air through. "Come on," he said quietly. "Let's go home." She followed him to the horses. They rode off the ridge together as the storm came in full over Ridgeline Mountain, and below them the valley was green and wet and waiting, and the spring ran clean behind them into 3 directions at once. They came down off the ridge in the dark. The storm had moved fast, faster than either of them had calculated, and by the time they cleared the upper switchbacks, the rain was coming sideways, and the trail was running with water, and the horses were working hard to keep their footing on ground that had turned slick and unreliable. Clara kept her eyes on Cade's back and kept Bess moving and didn't think about anything beyond the next 20 feet of trail. She thought about her father once. Just once. A brief involuntary thought, the kind that comes when your body is doing something difficult and your mind slips its leash for just a moment. She thought about him riding in weather like this, coming home late from town. The sound of his horse on the wet ground outside the window that meant everything was all right. That he was back. She pushed it down and kept riding. They reached the cabin close to 9 o'clock. Cade took both horses to the small barn, and she went inside and got the stove going, and hung their wet coats, and found dry clothes, and put the kettle on, and by the time he came in from the barn, she had the lamp lit, and the room warm, and 2 cups of tea on the table, because they had run out of coffee 2 days ago, and neither of them had made it to town to get more. He stood in the doorway for a moment, and looked at the lit room. Then he came in, and sat down, and wrapped both hands around the cup, and didn't say anything, which was exactly right, because there was nothing that needed to be said yet. And they had both learned by now that silence between them wasn't absence. It was a kind of presence, the kind that doesn't require maintenance. After a while she said, "The document is dry." She had kept it pressed against her chest under her coat the entire ride down, and it had survived. "Good," he said. "We need to file it first thing tomorrow." "I know. I'll ride down at first light." She looked at him across the table. He was tired, she could see it in the set of his shoulders, the slight heaviness around his eyes. Not the kind of tired that sleep fixes. The kind that comes from carrying something for a long time. "Cade," she said. He looked up. "When this is over," she said carefully, "when the filing is done and Crane is out of legal ground, what do you want?" He looked at her for a moment. "What do you mean?" "I mean we made an arrangement," she said. "A practical one. We both understood what it was, and you've held to it exactly as you said you would." She kept her voice even. "But I've been here a month, and the arrangement, the original arrangement, it doesn't feel like the whole picture anymore, and I want to know what you want the picture to be." The silence that came after that was different from other silences. It had edges. He set down the cup. He looked at his hands for a moment, those capable, careful hands that fixed fences and drove stakes into granite in the rain, and remembered to make coffee before anyone asked. "I'm not good at this," he said. "At what?" "At saying things." A pause. "At knowing what I want and saying it out loud before I've talked myself out of it." "Then don't talk yourself out of it," she said. "Just say it." He looked at her. "I want you to stay," he said. "Not because of the land, not because of Crane, because the cabin is different with you in it, and I'm different with you in it, and I'm not willing to pretend I haven't noticed that." He held her gaze steadily. "That's what I want. I understand if that's not what you want. I'll hold to the arrangement either way." Clara looked at him for a long moment. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. Something moved through his face, swift and quiet like light across water. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. They drank their tea. Outside, the rain came down over the mountain, and the spring ran into 3 valleys, and the stakes stood in the granite where he had driven them. Morning came clear. The storm had passed in the night, and left the world washed and still, and Cade was gone before she woke. She found a note on the table which surprised her because she hadn't known he wrote notes, and which said simply, "Gone to file. Back by noon. Coffee on the stove." And there was coffee on the stove kept warm on the low edge of the fire, which she thought was one of the most quietly decent things anyone had done for her in recent memory. She drank it and thought about what he'd said the night before. She wasn't a woman who had spent much time in her life being chosen. Not in the way that mattered. She had been useful to people, competent, reliable, the kind of person others leaned on without always noticing they were leaning. Her father had loved her, but he had also depended on her, and there was a difference between those two things that she had only begun to examine clearly in the weeks since he'd died. The difference between being needed and being wanted, between being kept and being chosen. Cade Merritt had looked at her across a table in a rainstorm and said, "I want you to stay," and the specific word he had used was, "want Not need not. It would be practical. Not any of the functional language they'd been living inside for a month. She washed the cup. She went outside. The air after the storm was the cleanest thing she knew, that particular mountain morning quality. Cool and sharp, with the smell of wet pine and distant water. She stood on the porch for a while and looked at the valley below and thought about her father's land, which was her land now, which was by extension part of this land. All of it connected by a water source on a granite ridge that two people had ridden through a storm to protect. She thought, I came up this mountain with nothing, and I am not leaving with nothing. It wasn't a thought about Cade exactly. Or it was about Cade, but it was also about something larger, about what it meant to decide to stay somewhere, not because you had no choice, but because you had looked at your options and chosen this one. That was different. That was a different kind of standing on the ground beneath your feet. She went back inside and started making breakfast. Cade was back before noon as promised, but he wasn't alone. He came up the trail with Tommy Reeves beside him, and behind Tommy, a woman she hadn't seen before, older, perhaps 60, with a posture that was very straight, and a face that Clara recognized in the way you recognize a type of person before you recognize the specific individual, someone who has lived a long time and has paid attention to most of it. Clara came to the door. Cade dismounted. "Filing's done," he said. "Spring claim is recorded." He nodded toward the older woman. "This is Ruth Aldridge. She was waiting at the county office." Ruth Aldridge looked at Clara with dark, direct eyes. "You're George Whitfield's daughter," she said. "Yes, ma'am. I knew your father." She dismounted efficiently without assistance, the way a person dismounts who has been doing it for 50 years. "I was his neighbor before I sold my place and moved to town, the western parcel that borders your lower field." Clara knew that parcel. Her father had mentioned Ruth Aldridge exactly once in a conversation about water drainage, and she hadn't connected the name until this moment. "Come in," she said. "All of you." They came in. Clara put coffee on, and they sat, Cade at the table, Tommy on the bench near the wall, Ruth in the chair nearest the door with her traveling bag on the floor beside her and her hat still on, which meant she didn't intend to stay long. "I heard what happened at the hearing," Ruth said, "and I heard about the spring claim." She looked at Cade. "Crane came to see me yesterday evening." The room went still. "He came to your home," Clara said. "He came to my rooms in town. He was polite. He's always polite." The word polite came out of her mouth the way you might describe something that looks clean but isn't. "He wanted to talk about a deed, specifically the deed to the western parcel I sold 6 years ago." "Who did you sell it to?" Cade said. Ruth looked at him. "I thought I sold it to a man named Harold Finch, a rancher from up north looking to expand his grazing operation." She paused. "Harold Finch, as it turns out, is Aldous Crane's brother-in-law." Clara set down the coffee pot. "He told me," Ruth continued, "that the deed I signed 6 years ago contained a clause I had not been shown at the time of signing. A right of first refusal clause which gives the current holder of that parcel the right to purchase adjacent land before any third-party sale or consolidation can take effect." She looked at Clara steadily. "He claims that clause applies to your land, that it predates your marriage and therefore predates your consolidation, that he can use it to force a purchase of your property at his assessed valuation." Cade was very still. "He brought documentation," he said. "He brought a copy of a deed." Ruth opened her traveling bag and put a folded document on the table. "I brought my copy, the one I've kept for 6 years." Cade reached across and took both documents. He spread them side by side. Clara watched his face as he read. She had learned to read Cade's face the way you learn to read weather, not by looking for drama, which it rarely produced, but by watching the small things. The slight tension at the corner of his jaw. The stillness that went a degree past his usual stillness. "These aren't the same document," he said. The room waited. "The clause is on the 3rd page," he said. "In your copy." He looked at Ruth. "It's not there." "No," Ruth said. "It is not. In his copy, it appears between paragraphs 4 and 5 on page 3. The typeface is slightly different. The margin spacing is different." He looked up. Someone added it after you signed. Ruth nodded once. That's what I thought, she said. That's why I came. Clara sat down slowly. He forged it, she said. Added to it, Cade said. The original document is legitimate. He had someone alter it after the fact. He looked at Ruth. How long ago did he come to you with this? Yesterday evening, Ruth said. He wanted me to confirm publicly that I had sold the parcel with that clause included. He wanted my word as the original seller. Her dark eyes were absolutely steady. I told him I needed to review my records first. He said he'd be in touch within the week. He needs your confirmation to make it stick, Clara said, understanding arriving fast. The altered deed alone isn't enough. He needs the original seller to validate it. Yes, Ruth said. And you came here instead. Ruth looked at her. I liked your father, she said simply. He was a man who did right by his neighbors without making a performance of it. When I was having trouble with the creek drainage in my last year on the property, he sent men over without being asked. He didn't invoice me. He didn't talk about it. She folded her hands in her lap. I'm not going to let his daughter lose her land because a man with money thinks the law is something you can reshape when you're not looking. Clara felt the pressure behind her eyes and breathed through it. Mrs. Aldridge, Cade said, will you sign an affidavit stating that the clause was not in the document at the time of your signing? I will, Ruth said. I'll do more than that. I'll go to the county attorney's office myself and present both documents and ask for a formal forgery investigation. The weight of that settled over the room, because this was different from what had come before. Challenging the land claim, demonstrating survey irregularities, fighting the consolidation complaint. Those were civil matters, legal disputes, the kind of thing that powerful men like Crane moved through with money and time and influence. Document forgery was criminal. Document forgery was something else entirely. He didn't know you kept your copy, Clara said. Most people don't keep their copies, Ruth said. He assumed I wouldn't. He assumed wrong, Cade said. Ruth allowed herself a small, precise expression that on another face might have been a smile. He assumed I was an old woman who signed papers and forgot about them, she said. He's made that mistake about a number of people. She stood. She picked up her bag. She looked at both of them. I'll go to the county attorney tomorrow morning. I'd suggest you both be there. We'll be there, Clara said. Ruth nodded. She put on her hat and looked at Cade. You built something good up here, she said. Don't let him take it. Then she walked out, and Tommy Reeves followed her, and Clara and Cade sat at the table with the two versions of the deed between them. Clara stared at the documents for a long time. Then she said, he was never going to stop. No, Cade said. Even after the hearing, even after the spring claim. He went back to his files and found another angle within 24 hours. That's who he is, Cade said. He doesn't experience what happened at the hearing as a defeat. He experiences it as a complication. He looked at the altered deed. This is what he does. He moves through the gaps. He finds the thing you didn't account for. But he didn't account for Ruth. He never accounts for the people he decides don't matter. Cade's voice was flat. That's always been his weakness. He counts money and land and legal mechanisms. He doesn't count people. Clara looked at him. You've been thinking about this for 3 years. I've been thinking about how to stop him for 3 years, he said. I didn't have the full picture. The survey irregularities weren't enough on their own. The water rights fight was one incident. He paused. The forgery, if Ruth's affidavit holds, and it will, that's the thing that brings everything else into focus. You can't separate a forged deed from the man who ordered it. If he forged this one, the county attorney is going to look at every other document he's ever filed. The implication of that opened out in front of her like a landscape. The land disputes across the valley. The deed challenges the easement claims. The water agreements that had been quietly restructured over years. All of it potentially tainted. All of it subject to review. The Garza parcel, she said. The one they lost in '87. And whatever the Murphys signed in '88, he said. And the Henderson verbal agreement that somehow became a written one. He looked at her. This doesn't just protect our land, Clara. If Ruth's affidavit triggers a formal investigation, It potentially undoes years of what Crane's been building in this valley. She sat with that. He must know that, she said. He must know that going after Ruth's confirmation is a risk. That if she didn't cooperate, he'd be exposed. He thought he was safe, Cade said. He had Fletcher, he had Hargrove, he had money and time, and the assumption that people do what they're expected to do. His voice carried something in it she didn't hear often. Something beneath the control, something that had weight behind it. He forgot that decent people, when they finally see the full picture, stop cooperating with indecent ones. Clara looked at him. "What happened to you?" she said carefully. "Before you came up this mountain. It wasn't just Nora, was it?" He was quiet. "You don't have to. Crane took a parcel from my father," he said. "Not this land, my family's original homestead 30 miles east. My father was sick in the winter of '83, and he signed something he shouldn't have signed because a man told him it was a loan extension, and it was a deed transfer." He set his hands flat on the table. "My father died that spring. I spent 2 years trying to get it back through legal channels. Fletcher was the lawyer on Crane's side." A pause. "I eventually let it go. Not because I accepted it, because the fight was costing me things I couldn't afford to lose, and I had to choose what to protect." Clara didn't say anything for a moment. "So you came up here," she said. "I came up here," he said. "And I started collecting documentation. And I waited." He looked at her. "I didn't know what I was waiting for." She held his gaze. "Your father came with grain in the winter," he said quietly. "And 2 years later, his daughter came up the mountain with a letter and a legal argument." He paused. "I reckon some things take the time they take." The lamp burned on the table between them. Clara looked down at the 2 versions of the deed, the honest one Ruth had kept in a trunk for 6 years, and the altered one Crane had produced, and the handwriting difference on page 3 that was visible if you knew where to look. "He's going to know she came to us," she said. "As soon as she walks into the county attorney's office, he'll know." "Yes." "Is he going to try to stop her?" Cade's jaw tightened. "He might. He's got men who do his errands." Clara stood. "Then she shouldn't go alone." He looked up at her. "I'll go with her tomorrow," she said. "And I want Tommy to bring his father and James Reeves to bring whoever he's talked to, and I want enough people walking into that county attorney's office that anyone watching understands this isn't one old woman making an accusation, it's half the valley presenting evidence." Cade looked at her for a long moment. Then he stood. "I'll ride down to the Reeves place tonight," he said. "I'll write to the Murphys," she said. "Tommy can carry it." He was already moving toward his coat. He stopped at the door and turned back. "Clara." She looked up. "When I said I was different with you here," he said, "I meant it." She held his gaze. "I know," she said. He held her gaze for one more moment. Then he went. She sat down and picked up a pen and started writing. The county attorney's office was on the east side of the building where the board hearing had been held, and when Clara arrived the next morning with Ruth Aldridge and Tommy Reeves and James Reeves and Patrick Murphy and Elena Garza, there was already a crowd. Not the same kind of crowd as the hearing. Smaller, more specific. The people who were there because they had chosen to be, which was a different thing from being curious. Cade was already at the door. He had ridden back from the Reeves place close to midnight, and she had heard him come in and go to bed without speaking, because there was nothing that needed to be said at midnight. She had written the letters he had written to deliver the word, both of them doing the work that needed doing without requiring any ceremony around it. He looked at the group assembled behind her, and something in his expression shifted with a quality she'd come to recognize as relief. Not the dramatic kind, but the kind that comes when you have been carrying an expectation of disappointment for a long time, and the world declines to deliver it. "Ruth," he said. "Merritt," she said. "Let's go in." The county attorney was a man named George Bassett, who Clara had never met, and who had the look of a person who takes his position seriously enough to sometimes make himself uncomfortable doing it. He listened to Ruth speak for 4 minutes. He looked at the 2 documents side by side for 6 minutes. He called in his assistant, and they conferred in low voices for another 3. Then he looked up. "Mrs. Aldridge," he said, "I'm going to need your sworn statement, today if you're willing." "I'm willing," Ruth said. "I'm also going to need—" He looked at the group behind Clara. "I'm going to need to understand the scope of what you're telling me." "We'll tell you everything," Clara said. "All of us. In whatever order is most useful to you." Bassett looked at her. He looked at Cade. He looked at the documents on his desk. "Mr. Merritt," he said, "you mentioned you've been collecting documentation on Mr. Crane's property dealings for some time." 3 years, Cade said. "It's organized." Bassett nodded slowly. "I want to see all of it." And that was the moment Clara felt it, the particular quality of something that has been held back for a long time beginning to move. Not a dramatic shift, not a sudden crash, but the way a river begins to move when a long-standing obstruction finally gives way, first just a seep, then a trickle, and then the full weight of everything that had been waiting behind it. They were in Bassett's office for 4 hours. Crane arrived at the building partway through. She knew this because there was a brief commotion in the outer room that was quickly resolved, and then he left, and she thought about him leaving. Walking out of that building, knowing that what was happening in the room he couldn't enter was not something he could stop anymore. He'd spent years making himself the man everyone in this valley had to account for, and the thing he had never accounted for was the possibility that they would all stop doing it at the same time. When they finally came out into the afternoon, the summer light was going long and gold across the street, and the group of them stood together on the boardwalk. Clara and Cade and Ruth and the Reeves family, and the Murphys and Elena Garza, and nobody said anything for a moment, because there wasn't anything that needed to be said that the moment wasn't already saying. James Reeves was the one who finally spoke. 30 years, he said. "I've been in this valley 30 years. I never saw anything like what just happened in that room." "Neither did I," Patrick Murphy said. Ruth Aldridge looked at Clara. "Your father would have stood right there and said nothing, and looked like that was the way things were supposed to be," she said. "He was that kind of man." Clara looked at the street, at the town that had watched her walk to that church, and whispered, "Poor thing, and what was she thinking? And I heard she had no choice." "I had a choice," she said, not loudly. To Ruth, to herself, to whatever version of her father was paying attention. "I just made the one people didn't expect." Ruth looked at her with those dark, direct eyes, and said nothing, which was the highest compliment Clara had received in a very long time. Beside her, Cade said quietly, "You ready to go home?" She turned and looked at him. This man on a mountain that people called a ghost, who drove stakes into granite in a rainstorm and made coffee before she woke, and kept his mother's poetry books because she had marked the ones she loved, and she thought yes. "Yes," she said. They walked to the horses together. From the end of the street, Margaret Holt stood in front of her store and watched them go, and she was smiling in the way of a woman who has been waiting to see something for a long time, and is glad she lived long enough to see it. 2 weeks later, a letter arrived from the territorial governor's office. Cade was in the barn when it came. Clara was at the work table with the survey maps, which she had begun to learn in earnest, because the North Face claim required formal documentation that she had decided she was going to understand completely, rather than only partially. The letter was formal and dry, and full of language. She had to read twice, but the substance of it was this: the county attorney had forwarded the evidence of document fraud to the territorial level. A formal investigation had been opened into Aldous Crane's land dealings in Sutter's Crossing and the surrounding valley, and all property transactions involving Crane or his affiliated parties from the period of 1883 to the present were subject to review. She read it a third time. Then she went to the barn door and said, "Cade." He came out. She handed him the letter. He read it. His face was very still throughout, as it always was when he was reading something that required him to be sure before he reacted. Then he read it again. Then he looked up. "It's not finished," he said. "No," she said. "It'll take time. The investigation will take months, maybe longer. The Garza parcel might come back to them. It might," she said. "Or it might not. But it'll be looked at honestly. That's something." He nodded. He folded the letter and handed it back and looked at the valley below, at the green summer hills and the creek line she could trace from here and somewhere beyond the tree cover. The 2 cottonwood trees she hadn't been to see since she'd come up the mountain, the ones her father had planted the year she was born. "I want to go to the graves," she said. He looked at her. "Tomorrow," she said. "I want to go down to the lower field and sit with them for a while." She looked at the valley. "Is that all right?" "You don't need to ask me," he said. "I'm not asking permission," she said. "I'm asking if you'll come with me." He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. "I'll come." She looked at the letter in her hand. She thought about Aldous Crane sitting somewhere in town tonight, reading whatever version of this letter had arrived for him, understanding that the walls of the thing he had built were no longer load-bearing. She felt no particular satisfaction at the image. Only the clean, quiet feeling of something being correctly settled the way you feel when a fence is mended and the line is true. She went back inside. She put the letter in the document binder. She made dinner. Cade came in from the barn and washed his hands and sat down, and when she set the plate in front of him, he looked up at her with the particular look, the one that lived between gratitude and something more than that, something that was still learning its own name, and he said, "Smells good." "Eat before it gets cold," she said, and she sat across from him, and they ate, and the mountain was quiet around them, and for the first time since her father died, the quiet felt like something she was inside rather than something pressing in from outside. That was different. That was everything. They rode down to the lower field the next morning. The cottonwood trees were exactly where she remembered them, at the western edge of the property, where the ground flattened, before it met the creek, where her father had planted 2 saplings. The spring she was born, and watched them grow for 26 years into something that gave shade. The graves were beneath them, marked simply the way her father had wanted things, her mother's name and dates, and now beside it, his own. Both stones set level and clean, because a neighbor had seen to them while Clara was fighting for the land that held them. She stood at the graves for a long time. Cade stood a few feet behind her, hat in his hands, giving her the distance without making it a departure. She hadn't cried. She had thought she might, coming down the trail with the morning still cool and the valley stretching out below them. But what she felt standing here wasn't grief exactly, or it was grief, but it was grief that had found its proper place inside her, no longer pushing against everything else, but settled, held. "He would have liked you," she said. She wasn't looking at Cade when she said it. She was looking at the stones. "He liked people who said what they meant," she said. "He didn't have much patience for performance." She paused. "He would have offered you coffee and talked about the weather, and never once mentioned any of this, the land, the fighting, any of it, and you would have left thinking it was a pleasant visit. But he would have known. He always knew." Cade was quiet behind her. "I think he knew something was coming," she said. "Before he died. He was tired in a way that wasn't the work I could tell the difference by then after years of watching him. He was tired in the way of a man who's been keeping something at bay for a long time." She pressed her hand briefly against the top of her father's stone. "I think he was afraid of what would happen to this land when he was gone. I think he carried that. I wish he hadn't had to." She stepped back. She turned and looked at Cade. He was watching her with those pale gray eyes that she had learned to read, that she was still learning to read, because he had layers that revealed themselves slowly and in no particular order, like a landscape you think you understand until the light changes. "He doesn't have to carry it anymore," Cade said. "No," she said. "He doesn't." She picked up Bess's reins. "Thank you," she said, "for coming." "I told you I would," he said. She looked at him. "I know. I'm thanking you anyway." He put his hat on. Something in the line of his shoulders was different from the way it had been a month ago. Less braced, she thought. Less organized against the possibility of something coming. Like a man who has been holding a door shut for a long time and has recently decided that what's on the other side is not what he was afraid of. They rode back up the mountain together. The investigation moved the way. Government things moved, not fast, but steadily, with the particular momentum of a process that has been correctly set in motion and no longer requires human urgency to maintain itself. George Bassett sent word twice in the following weeks. First, to confirm that the forgery finding on the Aldridge deed had been formally substantiated by a document examiner brought in from the territorial capital. Second, to let them know that Crane's legal team had filed a counter-complaint claiming the original consolidation was invalid, a last attempt to reopen ground that had been closed, and that Bassett had dismissed it in 4 sentences. Clara read both letters at the work table and filed them in the binder and went back to whatever she had been doing, and Cade watched her do it with the expression of a man who is observing something he finds quietly remarkable and has no particular intention of saying so out loud. He didn't need to. She had noticed in the weeks since the hearing that they had developed a language between them that wasn't words. Not the absence of words, they talked more than she'd expected from a man. People described as stone, but a parallel language of gesture and proximity, and the particular quality of paying attention to each other without making a performance of it. She knew when he was worried before he said anything, because his coffee went cold twice. He knew when she was frustrated before she said anything, because she got very methodical and quiet, and he would find something useful to do in the same room without asking whether she wanted company. She had stopped analyzing it. It was what it was, and what it was good. The morning Aldous Crane left Sutter's Crossing, nobody told them directly. Tommy Reeves rode up 3 days after the fact, with the particular expression of a young man delivering news he's been looking forward to delivering. He said Crane had packed 2 wagons and left on a Tuesday quietly, before most of the town was awake, his house locked, his office closed. Fletcher gone the week before. He said people had come out of their shops and homes and stood on the boardwalk and watched the wagons go without saying much, because there wasn't much to say that the watching didn't already say. He said James Reeves had stood on the steps of the feed store and watched until the wagons were out of sight, and then gone back inside and started his morning the same as any other morning, which Tommy seemed to feel was the right response. "What about the lumber mill?" Cade asked. "Bassett's got a notice on it," Tommy said. "It's part of the investigation. Nobody can touch it until the review is done." "And the families, the ones with the disputed claims. Bassett said it could take a year, maybe more." Tommy turned his hat over in his hands. "The Garza brothers are hopeful. My pa says to not count anything until the paper comes through, but he's hopeful too." Clara looked at Tommy, this boy who'd ridden up a mountain with bad news, and then kept riding up with whatever news there was because he'd decided somewhere along the way that this was where things were being dealt with honestly. "How are you doing, Tommy?" she said. He looked slightly startled. People apparently didn't ask him that very often. "Fine, ma'am. Good." A pause. "My pa's sleeping better." "Good," she said. "That matters." He nodded. He put his hat on. He looked at them both with the frank admiration of a young man who hasn't yet learned to keep that kind of thing off his face, which she found entirely endearing. "You two did something," he said. "What you did, most people would have most people couldn't have." He stopped. Tried again. "It was something," he said. "That's all." He rode back down the trail. Clara and Cade stood on the porch and watched him go. "He's going to be all right," she said. "Yes," Cade said. "He is." She looked at Cade. He was watching the trail with the expression he sometimes wore when he was thinking about something that was more than the immediate moment. "What?" she said. He was quiet for a beat. Then, "I've been on this mountain for 3 years watching this valley get smaller under Crane's hand. Watching people lose things. Watching them go quiet, because going quiet was the only option that didn't cost them everything immediately." He paused. "I told myself I was protecting what was mine. Collecting evidence. Waiting for the right moment." "You were," she said. "I was also hiding," he said. "That's the part I've been sitting with." He turned and looked at her directly, that pale gray gaze that didn't flinch and didn't perform. "I had enough to cause trouble for Crane 2 years ago. Not enough to win maybe, but enough to make it harder for him. I didn't, because I told myself the time wasn't right." A pause. "The time wasn't right because I didn't want to do it alone. And I didn't know how to say that, so I called it strategy." Clara looked at him. "You're saying it now," she said. "I'm saying it now," he agreed. She held his gaze. "I was hiding too," she said. On the other end of it, I spent 6 weeks after my father died being practical, being organized, being the person who keeps it together. She looked at the valley. I didn't let myself fall apart because I was afraid if I started I wouldn't stop. And the whole time I was being so practical, I was terrified. I know, he said. She looked at him. You knew. You came up that mountain, he said, with a legal argument prepared and a backup plan and the name of a relevant statute and the specific language of a consolidation mechanism that most lawyers in this territory wouldn't know off the top of their heads. He paused. That's not the work of a woman who's calm. That's the work of a woman who's scared and channeling every bit of it into something she can control. A beat. I recognized it because I do the same thing. Clara looked at him for a long moment. We're a pair, she said. Something moved in his expression, brief and warm, like a window opened and closed. Reckon we are, he said. The twist that changed everything came not from Crane and not from Bassett and not from any of the legal machinery they had set in motion. It came from a letter, addressed to Clara, postmarked from a town 300 miles east. She found it on a Wednesday morning slipped under the front door, which meant someone had brought it up the mountain rather than it coming through the Sutter's Crossing post, which meant someone had made a deliberate choice to deliver it personally and anonymously. The handwriting on the envelope was neat and unfamiliar. Inside was a single page. She read it twice before she understood what she was holding. Then she sat down at the table and read it a third time. The letter was from a woman named Elaine Finch, Harold Finch's wife, Crane's sister. It was 2 paragraphs long, and it was the most precisely devastating thing Clara had read since the first letter from Crane himself, except that it worked in the opposite direction. Elaine Finch wrote that she had been aware of her brother's methods for years, that she had not spoken because speaking had costs, and she had a family, and she had told herself the way people tell themselves things that let them sleep, that it was not her business. She wrote that she had seen the letter from Bassett's office that had arrived at her husband's address, Harold Finch being a named party in the investigation, and that she had spent 2 weeks deciding what to do about it. She had decided to tell Clara that there were 2 more documents, not forged after the fact, like the Aldridge deed. Original documents signed by Crane himself from 1884 and 1886 respectively, in which he explicitly authorized the fraudulent restructuring of 2 family agreements by creating backdated amendments. She had kept copies of these documents for 8 years. She was prepared to submit them to the territorial investigation. She was writing to Clara because she had read Clara's name in the investigation notice and had thought this woman fought. This woman did not go quiet, and she did not want to go quiet anymore either. At the bottom of the page, in smaller handwriting as though it had been added after the main letter was finished, she had written, "My father lost land to my brother too. Different state, different year. Same method. I should have said something sooner. I am sorry I did not." Clara sat at the table with the letter in her hands. She heard Cade come in from outside. She didn't say anything. She just held the letter out. He took it, read it. The silence while he read had a quality she'd come to know, the silence of information arriving and being processed by a mind that took things seriously and didn't rush its own understanding. When he finished, he set the letter down. "His own sister," he said. "Yes." "She's had those documents for 8 years." "Yes." Howe was quiet for a moment. "She came to it in her own time," he said. "Not a judgment. An acknowledgement of something true about how people work, that they arrive at the right thing when they arrive at it, and the arriving is sometimes slow, and the slowness is its own kind of cost." "I need to write back to her," Clara said. "Yes," he said. "And we need to get this to Bassett today." "I'll ride down this morning." She looked up at him. "I'll come with you." He looked at her. Then he looked at the letter. Then back at her. "You know what this means," he said. "It means the investigation has teeth it didn't have before," she said. "It means the case against him isn't just about what he did to this valley. It's about a pattern, a long one." "It means Crane's likely looking at criminal prosecution," Cade said. "Not just civil review." The weight of that settled over the room. She thought about Aldous Crane on those wagons leaving Sutter's Crossing on a Tuesday before the town was awake. She wondered if he'd known this was coming, if Elaine had warned him, or if she'd made her decision after he was already gone. She thought it probably didn't matter. A man who builds the way Crane built on other people's fear and silence, and the assumption that nobody would ever look too hard, carries that structure inside him wherever he goes. There was no wagon he could drive far enough. "Let's go," she said. Bassett read. Elaine Finch's letter, with the careful focus of a man who is realizing that a case he thought he understood has just become something larger. When he finished, he set it down and looked at Clara and Cade across his desk with an expression that was not quite awe, but was in that neighborhood. "She's willing to testify," he said. "She says she is," Clara said. "I'll confirm it in writing today." Bassett looked at the letter again. "If these documents are what she says, they are original, signed, explicit. This isn't a property dispute anymore." "No," Cade said. "This is fraud and criminal conspiracy across multiple territories." Bassett set his pen down. "I'm going to need to contact the Territorial Attorney General's office." "I know," Clara said. "This is going to take considerably longer than the original investigation." "I know that too." Bassett looked at her. "Are you prepared for that? For the possibility that this goes on for another year, maybe two, before any final resolution?" Clara looked at him steadily. "Mr. Bassett," she said, "I rode up a mountain in the middle of summer to marry a man I'd met once in a dress that didn't fit, because it was the only way to hold on to the land my father left me. I repaired fence in July heat. I rode through a mountain storm to drive stakes into granite, and I sat in your office for 4 hours while 11 families told you what one man had done to this valley for 30 years. She paused. 2 more years is fine. Bassett looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Cade. "You've got a remarkable wife," he said. Cade said without hesitation and without performance, "I know." Clara looked at him. He was looking at Bassett, and his face was entirely steady and entirely genuine, and she thought, there it is. That's the whole thing. That's what was underneath all of it. She looked back at Bassett. "What do you need from us today?" They had dinner that evening at Margaret's. Not a planned thing, but Margaret had seen them come out of Bassett's office and had simply opened the door of her back room and said, "Come eat," in the tone of someone who is not extending an invitation so much as issuing a calm directive, and they had come. Margaret fed them roast chicken and bread and coffee, so strong it almost stood on its own, and she listened to everything they told her without interrupting and without expressing surprise at any of it, because Margaret Holt had reached an age where very little surprised her, and she had made a kind of peace with that. When they finished, she looked at them both for a moment. "I want to tell you something," she said. "And I'm only going to say it once, so listen." They listened. "When I told Clara to go up that mountain," she said, "I was making a practical suggestion. I had information about Crane, and I had information about Merritt, and I put the two together, and I thought this could work legally. That was all I was thinking." She wrapped her hands around her cup. "I was not thinking about what the two of you would be to each other. That wasn't part of my calculation. I want you to know that, because I don't want either of you thinking this was arranged by anyone other than yourselves." She looked at Clara. "You chose to go up. You chose to knock on that door." She looked at Cade. "You chose to open it. What came after was yours." Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then Cade said, "Thank you, Margaret." It was the first time Clara had heard him use her first name without the Mrs., and Margaret noticed it too. Something shifted briefly in her expression, warm and precise. "Go home," Margaret said. "Both of you." They rode back up the mountain in the late summer evening, the air going cool as it always did above a certain elevation, the sky overhead moving from gold to the deep blue that comes just before dark, and Clara rode beside Cade on a trail she now knew well enough that she could read it in the low light without thinking about it. About halfway up, Cade said, "The investigation is going to bring people to this mountain." "I know," she said. "Bassett. Possibly people from the territorial office. Reporters if it goes the way it might." "I know," she said again. "You're not bothered by that." It wasn't quite a question. She heard it for what it was, not concern about her exactly, but something closer to wanting to make sure she had accounted for it. That she had counted the cost of what they'd done, and was all right with the tally. "I'm not bothered," she said. "Are you?" He rode for a moment. "3 years ago," he said, "I came up this mountain to be left alone. I built something I could defend, and I told myself that was enough." A pause. "It wasn't enough. I think I knew it wasn't enough, and I was very committed to not examining that too closely. And now," she said. He looked at her sideways in the failing light. "Now the mountain has 11 families who trust us a water source that belongs to all of them, and a woman who makes breakfast at dawn, and argues with county boards, and somehow convinced a man who'd spent 3 years in deliberate isolation that people are worth the trouble they come with." Clara looked ahead at the trail. "That woman sounds exhausting," she said. "She is," he said. "She's also the best thing that's knocked on my door in 3 years. Clara didn't answer. She didn't need to. She pressed her heels to Bess's sides and moved up the trail, and she heard him follow, and the mountain held them both in the particular quiet of a summer evening that has no argument to make, only the offer of itself, steady and real and sufficient. The hardest moment came 3 weeks later, and it came from nowhere, which is how the hardest moments come. She was at the work table sorting through survey documents when she found tucked between 2 pages she'd filed weeks ago the original letter. Crane's first letter. The one that had arrived 6 weeks after her father died, in the polite and weaponized language of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. She held it for a moment. She thought about the woman who had sat in Margaret's back room reading this letter for what felt like the 100th time, exhausted and frightened and furious, and trying to hold all 3 of those things inside a body that wasn't quite large enough for all of them. She thought about how alone that woman had felt. How the town had felt like a closed door she couldn't find the handle to. How she had looked at the mountains and thought there has to be something up there. She folded the letter. She got up. She went to the stove. She opened it and put the letter in and watched it burn. She didn't need it anymore. It had done what it was going to do. It had pushed her up a mountain, and the mountain had turned out to be worth climbing. She went back to the work table. Cade came in from outside a few minutes later and looked at her and then looked at the stove and then back at her. He didn't ask. "Old letter," she said. "Didn't need it anymore." He nodded once. He understood exactly what she meant. He poured 2 cups of coffee and brought hers to the table without being asked, and he sat across from her and picked up the survey map she'd been working on and said, "The north boundary marker on this is wrong. It's about 40 feet east of where it should be." She looked at the map. "How do you know?" "I pasted it in the spring of '89, and I remember the count." He pulled the map toward him and penciled in a correction with the easy authority of a man who trusts his own memory on the things that matter to him. She watched him. "Cade," she said. He looked up. "I'm glad I knocked on your door," she said. He held her gaze. "I'm glad you didn't leave when I didn't answer fast enough," he said. She smiled. It came up before she planned for it, which was the best kind. "I had nowhere else to go," she said. "Yes, you did," he said quietly. "You could have gone anywhere. You chose this." She looked at him, this man she had chosen, who had chosen her back in a space that had started as a legal arrangement and had become something that had no adequate legal language for it. "I chose this," she said, and she meant the mountain and the cabin, and the survey maps, and the coffee he made before she woke, and the poetry books his mother had marked, and she meant the valley below with its 11 families, and the spring running clean from the granite into 3 directions at once, and she meant him, all of him, the careful silences, and the words that came slowly, and were worth waiting for, and the pale gray eyes that saw her more accurately than she was sometimes comfortable with. She chose all of it. "Get back to work," he said, and pushed the map back toward her. She laughed, actually laughed, short and genuine, the kind that doesn't ask permission, and picked up her pencil. By the end of that summer, 2 things happened that the people of Sutter's Crossing talked about for years afterward. The first was that the territorial investigation formally expanded to include 3 counties and multiple properties, and George Bassett was quietly promoted to a position with the Territorial Attorney General's office in recognition of the scope of what had come out of a single county hearing on a Thursday morning in July. The second was that Cade Merritt came down off Ridgeline Mountain on a Tuesday afternoon, not to file papers, not to attend a hearing, not for any legal or practical purpose, and walked into Margaret Holt's dry goods store and bought a length of blue calico fabric and a small book of pressed mountain wildflowers that Margaret had kept in a case near the front window and told no one had looked at seriously in 2 years. Margaret had wrapped it in paper without comment. He had ridden back up the mountain with it in his saddlebag. Clara had found it on the work table when she came in from checking the horses. Just left there, unwrapped the calico folded neatly beside the little book, and no note, because he was not a man who wrote notes about things like this. She stood and looked at it for a long moment. She picked up the book of wildflowers and opened it and turned the pages slowly, each one holding a pressed flower from this mountain, or from mountains like it. Columbine, paintbrush, mountain aster, the small yellow ones she'd seen on the ridge the morning after the storm. She closed it carefully. She went to the door. Howe was coming up from the barn in his work clothes, with his hat pushed back on his head, and he looked at her in the doorway with the expression of a man who has done something that makes him feel exposed and is not entirely sure how to stand inside that feeling. She held up the book. He waited. "It's beautiful," she said. Something in him settled. "You said you wanted to know what was up here," he said. "Figured this was a start." "Come inside," she said. "I'll make coffee." He came inside. She made coffee. They sat at the table in the mountain cabin on a late summer evening, and the territory below them was still working its way through the long accounting of 30 years of one man's particular cruelty, and there was still work to do, and distance still to cover, and mornings still ahead of them that would ask hard things. But in the cabin on Ridgeline Mountain, in the place where a woman had knocked on a door with a letter in her hand and refused to fold the lamp, burned steady, and the coffee was hot, and the two people sitting across from each other had found in the improbable space between a legal arrangement and a summer storm and a signed document on a granite ridge something that was entirely and completely their own. She had cried on her wedding night. She had not cried because she was afraid of him. She had not cried because the arrangement was wrong. She had cried because she was alone, and she had not known in that moment that alone was not a permanent condition. That sometimes a door opened in the dark, and what was behind it was not what anyone expected, and what was behind it was worth every hard mile it had taken to arrive there. She knew it now. She set her cup down and looked at him across the table and thought, this is what chosen feels like. Not fallen into, not settled for, not arrived at by default. Chosen. Every morning of it. And that was everything.